Chapter 5, Part 2, Audio Recording. So, storing and serving food is going to be our next section. I'm finding with you all when you're looking up words. Now, I know something like in the chapter, it'll have different headings. So, for example, where's my mouse? So, this is a subheading. Okay, you need to watch for these because, for instance, on page 114, when I just finished talking about Suko is here, and then this subheading appears. And a lot of you seem to be mixing up the fact that where the image is what they're talking about. Okay, so storing and serving food is not what this image is about, but it is on that page because that's where the author found space for the image. Okay, be careful with that. All right, so this particular vessel, moving on, is a Greek hydria shape form. This is what that form is called. There are so many of these made throughout the Greek and Roman period too, but Greece really cranks out thousands of these. If you ever go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, there's a great, huge collection of all the different eras of these. This one is the archaic, and this is orange clay, and then black painted on top. And then if you look at those little lines, that is scratched out. That's called sgraffito. It's scratched out so that the lines of the clothing show through. And then that red clay of the actual vessel, the actual clay color, comes through. A little bit of white added on in here. A smidgen right there, a little bit right there. Later there's black on red wear and there's red on black wear. There's a bunch of different styles, and I would say before that too. Might be mixing that up right now. I haven't looked at this in a little while. This particular pottery is made in segments. This piece here up is made in one segment. That lip, I think, is even made in a separate segment. Then this part is made in one segment, and then the bottom's added onto it. If you ever take a wheel throwing class, you cannot make this form. I teach wheel throwing, and not that I've tried this too often because I learned that it was manufactured in parts and thrown separately before I attempted to make something this complex. At any rate, this is a water jug, and it's really nice because on this hydria, there are other, and these aren't hydria, these are different forms on here, but there are women carrying water jugs, so it's kind of interesting. That's a hydria looking one right there, but these I think are slightly different. But you see how they're collecting water from a fountain. This is an animal head with a fountain. That's very typical. That still exists today in parts of Europe where there would be a spring, and then they would put a brass or ceramic or stone carved animal head, usually a lion. I can't quite tell what that is, but that's a carved sort of a fountain head, and then the water would shoot down into the jugs. So this is highly decorated, really beautiful, graceful, gorgeous piece, and Greek pottery really became highly refined. This is a Chinese bronze vessel, three-legged ting with a cover, the Zhou dynasty, 6th century BC. Quite old, so that's before the Common Era. They don't say before Christ anymore. So usually you see BCE, same thing, year zero. So it's 600 years before the year zero. So that is 2,600 years ago. So an ancient Chinese bronze, this would store ritual wine. It's a bit fancy, perhaps, to store just regular water or something like that. So there's a lot of, this is a quatrefoil pattern here, going across here, and it's designed to be used as a serving bowl. There might be some sort of monster heads down here. I think they're down here. They're hard to see, sort of guarding the vessel, but this is a ritual wine vessel, China. Oops. And so we go on to another culture. You know, we're kind of all over the place here. Now we're into the Pomo tribe, which is a California tribe, and we're thinking about woven containers. So we looked at ceramics, we just looked at bronze, and now we're looking at basket weaving, and this would be for boiling acorns. Now this actually particular piece we're looking at is not for boiling acorns. We know this because there are feathers and shells attached to this, little tiny feathers. Most of those would be gone if this thing was exposed to high heat. Not open flame, but high heat where there's coals or something like that, or like a hot stone to boil acorns in it. We wouldn't be using a fancy vessel like this. It would just be kind of a straight basket with a little bit of decoration, such as these triangles that you see here woven into the basket. So this is a ceremonial particular piece, and it was given to mothers for their daughters during at the time of their wedding. This is about 100 years old. All right, gourds. Now you've seen gourds growing like a pumpkin or a squash. That's what a gourd is. Some gourds are specifically made to hold water in Africa. That is one place. They do have pottery in Africa. Metal came a little bit later to some cultures, and weaving is also something that happened in Africa as well. But in some places where gourds might have grown naturally, they use them for spoons, cut them down the middle, and then it's a nice spoon or a scoop of some kind. But if you leave it enclosed and you dry it out and you scoop out a bunch of the material, it's a nice water container. Now the actual gourd might have ended somewhere here initially. I don't know. This would be a really strange shape for a gourd, and it's very symmetrical. But at any rate, they like to embellish, which means to decorate or to, make it sort of customized for themselves. So they would cover it with beading, some really beautiful beading. So it's bead on cloth, and then it's over the gourd. Okay, so it's got cowrie shells too, which is a type of shell that's put in sometimes with the beadwork. Just gorgeous piece. Okay, ceremonial vessel. Anytime something is this highly decorated, it's either not actually used, but it looks like a useful vessel, or it's ceremonial and it's used once in a while, and it's like put on the mantelpiece. Okay, salt. Important to know that things like salt and pepper, which we all have on our table, and you even see it in sort of like inexpensive restaurants, diners, there's salt and pepper everywhere. It's super cheap. Well, that wasn't always the case, especially with the case with pepper. But salt, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, any of that stuff, people were shedding blood over these commodities. They were very expensive, very difficult to obtain. Not everybody had salt, and you need salt to live. Now, we always talk about going on a low salt diet and getting rid of salt in our diet, but part of the reason we overdid it and oversalted everything is because back in the 16th century or prior to that, not everybody had salt, so when you obtained it, it had to come from a long distance, and it was very important in maintaining the diet and to keeping people healthy to have some salt. So, pepper is even a longer story, which I won't get into, but large ships transporting this stuff, think about that. And so this is an Afro-Portuguese Sierra Leone, which we've heard of more recently with political issues, and part of that is because of this colonization from Portugal. So this particular piece, the salt is held in this orb-like container here, highly decorated. Again, this would be something that would be ceremonial or a wealthy person would have. What is thought with this piece is that the Portuguese people who wanted to buy it or have it, they gave the Africans the images they wanted on it, and then they carved it out. Now, this is important to note that below the salt, this gets into our hierarchical scale. Things that are lower than this salt are less important than things that are on top of the salt. And this is actually an execution scene. Don't know the whole story there, but this is carved out of ivory, very important piece, And the other thing I'm going to say about this is that it's half European looking with the way that European bodies would be depicted, and half African looking. So the idea of a salt cellar happening at all didn't happen in Africa. That's not a natural thing for African culture people to make. So that image is partly to this is partly to do with the Portuguese, and then there's sort of a halfway point of some Portuguese elements, some African elements, and this is where a lot of artwork really loses its. I honestly would say strength. In imagery, and the idea that you're letting other influences come in from cultures not your own, it sort of takes away from the piece, and that happens quite a bit. But in this particular case, our author is explaining it to us in this way. Okay, last one on this topic is going to be, well, I guess there's two more, but I'm going to stop after this. This is Andy Warhol, and these are boxes like you would have inside here. You would have all these. It says 24 number 2.5 cans, and this would be a bunch of ketchup in here, 2 dozen bottles of ketchup. So he is manufacturing. He's redoing this label. He's making up his own silk screens, and then he's taking a piece of cardboard in this case wood, and he's silk screening it onto the wood, and he's imitating the boxes. So he's commenting on the commercialness of food production, and he is making what we call pop art, which is just recreating objects that are around us like a realistic object, a mundane object. Okay, and then he's glorifying them into art icons. He's an interesting fellow, influenced art quite a bit in the 20th century. You have to read more about him, and there's a whole museum on him in Pittsburgh. Okay, I'm going to stop here.